Hello, today I will be presenting the impact of performance-enhancing drugs on athletes who use them, as well as how it affects their sport later on and within the moment. So the use of performance-enhancing drugs, or PEDs, create multiple health effects, risks an athlete's eligibility or shame within their sport, as well as the negative image it produces for themselves as a role model to like young athletes or fans who idolize them or look up to them. The three main points I'd like to discuss are the importance of how performance-enhancing drugs or PEDs risk an athlete's overall career. The only proven benefits is how it helps an athlete perform better within the moment, as well as ultimately produces the extreme negative health effects and psychological effects within that time or later on in life. And of course, it's going to affect each athlete individual in how much they take into their body, as well as like their health within that moment. It raises multiple questions based on whether to use performance-enhancing drugs or not. Obviously, there's the pros and cons side. There's those that obviously believe that it shouldn't be allowed, and therefore why it's still illegal, technically within many sports. Then there's also the pro side where they're like, oh, it does help. It's just an extra like chance for an athlete to get better, and it's out there potentially still for them. It's a problem within high school, college, and professional leagues. Athletes within all sports at all levels can basically still use them. It's just that they are legal and they are looked down upon. The most common performance-enhancing drugs, or PEDs, are anabolic steroids, human growth hormone, diuretics, and creatine. Many professional athletes choose to use these because it aids in muscle recovery and it helps them like within their sport, like with their strength and so on. Many athletes become dependent on using them rather than on how hard they work within like not using these drugs. And pressure is a big aspect within them choosing to use these drugs or not. Because they feel like they have that pressure to perform to the best of their ability, especially if they're in a team sport. Their spot could be taken. So that's where that pressure point of trying to use these drugs comes into play. It's also seen to many people on the con side of not wanting to use the drugs is it's an easy way out, like this drug group. It also alters the athlete's body within the moment and then also later on in life. Ravijern, an author of Nationwide's Children, has stated how it helps give energy to muscle and assists with muscle recovery. So, which basically provides the fact how it helps an athlete when they're lifting, they're able to gain more, and then ultimately like perform better within that kind of a legal standpoint. He basically provides the fact that they can lift more weights and assist recovery after this training. The USADA has also stated the fact that these drugs do have the ability to alter the human body and biological functions to improve this athletic performance, which raises multiple questions as to, because it can create long-term effects and short-term effects, which ultimately is not great for our health. The noted long-term effects are liver and heart failure, as well as with certain individuals, stroke, heart attack, basically like anything that's kind of going on with your health at the moment. Like if you have certain like back problems, shoulder problems, that could just add on to that. So really like it does help within the moment, but in the long term, like it does like not help you for like your long-term life. Short-term effects include depression, suicidal thoughts or feelings because you kind of feel guilty into using it, but you feel like you need it, which is kind of where that like effect comes in, where like you want to use it but then you don't want to use it, so it's like you're kind of like on the table about it, like on and off the table. So they feel ultimately at this point when they do take them that they feel like they cannot compete without the drugs like for the rest of their career, like within that season, based on what the USADA has collected. Risk of shame of eligibility is also a major aspect of using these drugs. Baseball's had multiple problems with this among certain athletes. Alex Rodriguez is one of them. it ultimately risked his playing time and if he could ultimately play within a season. A-Rod has been known for doping also, which is in taking performance-enhancing drugs. In a report by ESPN, he was interviewed by investigators, and A-Rod had told these investigators that he had used illegal substances between late 2010 and October 2012. It included how he had used testosterone cream, gummies, and human growth hormone. He was suspended by the MLB for the majority of the 2014 season, even though it was a few years after that, because they potentially didn't really catch him, as you could say. And this happened within a team he played for back in 2010, 2011, but in 2014 when he played for the Yankees, he was suspended for a majority of the season, and he still technically got paid, but he couldn't play within those games. But then it kind of makes it difficult when he came back, because ultimately a lot of fans like looked down upon him for it, and kind of like disrespected him in that way of like booing him, like not cheering him on. But then there's still those that still root for him. They understood that this was just a difficult point for that, but they still ultimately were his fans. So because of this, he started to feel like the shame kind of was starting to be felt within the Yankees, and then obviously when he'd come up to play it again, because obviously everybody knew that he had been doping, and ultimately led into him being suspended from a new team in the future. And then ultimately when using these PEDs, it created that negative image for him as a role model. There's still those that look up to him, and as of right now, he has come back. He's made shows about coming back into the game, so ultimately he has that's been a turning point where he turned his life back on the right track because of that, and is still looked at as a role model today. But it did start to become an unfair advantage, and fans did start to take notice of that. But because that is ultimately now 7 years in the past, he has come back from it by creating these shows and speaking out upon how he had made this mistake, but he's not turning back, and he's looking to move his life into the right direction and be there for people who look up to him. But ultimately, he has faced consequences, and he will not be able to be inducted in the Hall of Fame, even though he has had great numbers. He's led the team in the MLB in multiple categories, but because of him being caught for that, it ultimately does affect that, and stripped from certain titles within the sport. So all in all, the three main points I have discussed is how multiple negative health effects come into play when using these performance-enhancing drugs, as well as how it risks eligibility and shame within an athlete's sport, depending on what sport they happen to play. It also produces a negative image, eligibility, shame in sport for athletes as a role model as well when it comes to this. Also, it does help an athlete in the short term, but in the long term, it can risk reputation, health effects, negative health effects ultimately, and also psychological, like I discussed, the long-term effects. Many athletes who have used them within their young life, within their older life, they have started to feel the repercussions of this. And although people's past, they ultimately have to get to a certain level, like college or professional, but then when they do use the performance-enhancing drugs, it does help them within the moment, and ultimately can create better numbers, everything like that. But the long term does get affected, because when people find out, if you get drug tested, it does put that in the hands of your eligibility and how you can potentially play or not. So that is how performance-enhancing drugs ultimately is not the best route to follow, and how it is still not used, and is why it is illegal still in sports today. So